In less than a year, something extraordinary happened in a land many of us never expected to lead a global conversation. Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country once known only for poverty and instability, just did what the world said Africa couldn't. It turned gold into power. For decades, the nation's treasures were written into foreign contracts, exported through foreign banks, and priced in foreign currencies. Every ounce of gold dug from its soil made someone richer somewhere else, but never the people who lived above it. And yet against this backdrop of dependency, a young soldier named Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward with one radical idea. Independence without ownership is theater. When he took power in 2022, the world barely noticed. There were no grand declarations, no headlines promising miracles. But quietly beneath the dust of the Sahel, Traore began to rewrite the rules. He reviewed old mining deals that had been signed under pressure, reclaimed 5 foreign-operated mines, and demanded that the profits from Burkina Faso's gold stay where the gold was born. It was an act of defiance, but also of arithmetic. Within a single year, his government reported more than $18 billion in gold revenue. Not from charity, not from loans, but from ownership. To many in the West, this was shocking. To Africans, it was justice long overdue. They called it resource nationalism. He called it economic dignity. And as the numbers grew, so did a question that no one could easily answer. If a poor nation can rise by keeping what already belongs to it, what does that say about the world that told it not to try? Because this story isn't just about gold. It's about the courage to measure wealth not in tons of metal, but in tons of freedom. And that's exactly what Captain Ibrahim Traoré is doing today in the heart of Africa. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed leadership in 2022, he didn't inherit a nation, he inherited a system. A system built by contracts, consultants, and creditors who never set foot in the villages their signatures condemned to poverty. Burkina Faso's mining industry, once celebrated as a symbol of progress, had become what Traoré called a skeleton wearing someone else's skin. For decades, international mining giants operated under colonial-style agreements written in distant boardrooms. They enjoyed tax exemptions, exported unreported volumes, inflated their costs, and sent the real profits to offshore accounts. Meanwhile, the miners who risked their lives underground went home each night with barely enough to feed their families. Gold, the country's greatest gift, had become its curse. Traoré saw the pattern clearly. Africa's wealth was not disappearing by accident. It was disappearing by design. And if it was designed, then it could be redesigned. So he began where few African leaders ever dared to begin, with an audit. His administration reviewed every active mining agreement in the country. What they found was staggering underreported production fake exploration costs and an elaborate network of shell companies used to avoid taxes. It was, as one official put it, the most polite form of theft ever invented. But Traoré wasn't interested in outrage, he wanted leverage. He realized that court battles in foreign jurisdictions would take years and cost fortunes. Instead, he went straight to the heart of the system, the law itself. Within months, his government drafted a new mining code that would permanently change the arithmetic of power. Under the new code, the state held majority ownership in all future mining ventures. Companies that violated transparency laws could have their licenses suspended or revoked without the need for foreign court approval. A fixed percentage of profits had to be reinvested inside Burkina Faso into local industries, infrastructure, and communities. For the first time, the rules were written in the language of fairness, not dependence. Western analysts called it resource nationalism. Traoré called it economic correction. He wanted the nation to stop begging for a share of its own wealth and start claiming it as a right. His decision to reclaim 5 major foreign-operated mines was both symbolic and strategic. Each mine represented a chapter of exploitation rewritten into a chapter of recovery. And though critics predicted economic collapse, something very different happened. Production continued, taxes were collected, and the state treasury began to swell. The numbers told a story no propaganda could dismiss. Within the first fiscal year, Burkina Faso earned $18 billion in gold revenue. This wasn't luck. It was disciplined transparency and the understanding that you can't build sovereignty on leased ground. Traoré's reforms didn't isolate Burkina Faso, they insulated it. He was creating what his advisors called sovereign circulation, a loop where wealth generated in the nation finally stayed within its borders. To many outside observers, it felt like a rebellion against the global order. To those inside Burkina Faso, it felt like the first honest day's work in generations. For the first time, miners saw the government not as a referee, but as a partner. Villagers began to believe that their sweat was building their country, not someone else's balance sheet. And when foreign advisors warned that nationalization might scare investors away, Traoré answered with a question that has since echoed through the Sahel. If our independence isolates us, what exactly were we connected to before? It was a quiet line, but it carried the weight of history. Because in that question lay the essence of his leadership defiance reason and an unshakable belief that Africa's future could no longer be outsourced. Burkina Faso had begun its boldest experiment yet, not in revolution, but in arithmetic justice. The gold that once fueled dependency was now financing freedom. And the world, for the first time in decades, was forced to look twice at a country it used to overlook. The moment the numbers were made public, the world blinked. $18 billion in gold revenue from a country the IMF once labeled aid-dependent. Burkina Faso had just rewritten what was possible for Africa. And for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this wasn't just about numbers. It was about dignity, measured in currency, not in charity. In the capital city of Ouagadougou, the announcement was met not with parades, but with quiet pride. Men and women who had spent their lives watching foreign trucks leave their towns loaded with unrefined gold finally saw something different, the gold staying home. The new national gold refinery, capable of processing 400 kilograms per day, became the symbol of a new chapter. For the first time, the nation could decide its own price, its own process, and its own profit. It was more than a refinery. It was a firewall, a barrier against the invisible theft that had drained Africa for centuries. Gold that once traveled to Europe to be valued abroad was now being valued under Burkinabe skies. In Traoré's words, every gram that stays home strengthens our sovereignty. But the West didn't see it that way. International analysts called his reforms reckless investors, whispered about instability, and Western diplomats warned of regional isolation. The Financial Times questioned whether Burkina Faso was chasing political symbolism over economic sense. Yet, on the ground, the story looked different. Markets may have trembled, but citizens didn't. They understood something investors couldn't, that true instability doesn't come from scaring investors. It comes from starving citizens. While capital fled, confidence returned. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for foreign validation. It was defining its own metrics of success in jobs created, factories built, and energy projects launched. Solar grids in Ziga and Lumbila hydroelectric dams in Bagre and new agricultural processing plants funded by gold revenue all began to rise. The logic was simple, yet revolutionary development without debt. And that, more than any speech, terrified those who once controlled Africa's purse strings. Across the Sahel, something began to shift. In Mali, lawmakers studied Traoré's mining reforms and passed similar measures: higher state equity, stricter export rules, and a sovereign mining fund. In Niger, newly empowered leaders turned to uranium, the mineral that had powered France's nuclear ambitions for decades. For the first time, they demanded transparency from the French energy giant Orano. The West called it provocation. The Sahel called it balance. And in that balance, a new alliance was born, AES, the Alliance of Sahel States. It wasn't conceived in Paris or Washington, but in the quiet understanding of shared struggle. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations, once defined by instability, now began coordinating defense trade and resource policy. They were no longer waiting to be managed. They were learning to manage themselves. The symbolism was powerful. Three flags that had once flown beneath the shadow of external control now stood side by side, representing a collective refusal to stay poor on rich land. Analysts called it a geopolitical risk. But to millions across Africa, it was hope with a heartbeat. For the first time, the Sahel was exporting not minerals, but an idea that ownership works. And as the gold continued to flow into Burkina Faso's treasury, so did something far rarer in international politics: belief. Belief that a soldier's discipline could rebuild an economy. Belief that independence could finally mean more than a flag and an anthem. But every movement that rises against an old order must face its reckoning. Because when a nation turns gold into sovereignty, it doesn't just change its economy, it challenges the hierarchy of the world itself. The question now wasn't whether Burkina Faso could survive its success. It was whether the world would let it. The true measure of any revolution is not in its speeches, but in its impact on ordinary lives. In Burkina Faso, that impact can be seen in the quiet hum of new factories, the glow of solar grids after dusk, and the confidence in the voices of workers who now believe that their labor finally belongs to them. For decades, the economy had functioned like a funnel: wide at the top, narrow at the bottom. Wealth entered through foreign investment and leaked back out through profit repatriation, leaving only dust for the people who dug the gold. Traoré's reforms flipped that funnel. He turned it into a circle: wealth generated inside the nation now circulates within it. That's what his economic advisors called sovereign circulation. The $18 billion in gold revenue became the foundation of something Burkina Faso had not experienced in living memory: self-financed development. Instead of borrowing from the IMF or negotiating for conditional loans, the state began investing its own earnings into infrastructure, agriculture, and energy. The logic was simple: if a nation can fund its own growth, it can also fund its own freedom. One of the first visible symbols of this new logic stood in Bobo Dioulasso, where a state-backed tomato processing factory opened its doors. For the farmers nearby, this was more than a plant. It was proof that the days of exporting raw produce and importing canned goods were ending. Local tomatoes were now being processed, packaged, and exported under Burkinabe labels. For the first time, profit stayed in the soil where it began. The same transformation unfolded in the rice and cotton sectors, where state-supported cooperatives replaced foreign intermediaries. The goal wasn't isolation. It was independence through productivity. As one farmer told a local journalist, "We're no longer waiting for help. We're working for ourselves." Energy followed the same philosophy. Solar farms in Ziga and Lumbila, hydroelectric stations in Bagre, and rural electrification projects were financed directly by gold revenue, not foreign debt. In the words of one engineer, every light that turns on here is powered by Burkinabe gold. To Traoré, this wasn't symbolism, it was strategy. He often reminded his cabinet, "A nation that must beg for electricity will eventually beg for everything else." But economic transformation was only half the story. The other half was psychological. For the first time, Burkinabe citizens began to see their government not as an abstract authority, but as a participant in production. The state had become a shareholder in the people's future. That subtle shift from watching to owning ignited something that no foreign program ever could trust. Patriotism, long eroded by poverty and corruption, began to resurface. Public workers accepted temporary wage freezes without protest, understanding that the funds were being redirected into national projects. Young people who once dreamed of leaving for Europe started applying for training positions at the new refineries and agro-industrial centers. In Ouagadougou's markets, the slogan "We mine, we refine, we rise" appeared on murals and shop fronts. It wasn't propaganda. It was pride. Still, change on this scale invited resistance. Some domestic elites, politicians, old business networks, and former intermediaries of foreign corporations saw their influence shrink. They warned of economic isolation, of a return to socialism. But the warnings rang hollow as the evidence grew visible. Production was steady, revenue was rising, and unemployment was falling. The numbers spoke louder than ideology. Traoré's leadership style remained consistent, firm, quiet, and deeply pragmatic. He didn't chase applause, and he didn't fear criticism. When asked by a European journalist whether his government's methods resembled state capitalism, he replied simply, "If capitalism means ownership, then yes, we're finally capitalists in our own country." Underneath the reforms was something even more profound: a new social contract. Citizens gave the government legitimacy. The government returned it through tangible progress. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional, and in a region long defined by dysfunction, that alone was revolutionary. By the end of the second year, Burkina Faso was no longer defined by what it lacked, but by what it kept. Its gold didn't just build refineries, it built self-respect. Its policies didn't just generate revenue, they generated faith. And for a generation that had grown up believing their country's destiny was written abroad, Traoré's reforms had rewritten it at home. In Washington and Brussels, the reaction was mixed admiration in whispers, concern in headlines. Policy analysts framed Burkina Faso's success as a temporary surge, warning that resource nationalism could scare away investment. But behind closed doors, strategists knew something deeper was happening. Africa was learning to fund itself. And that, more than any military coup or election, was the real shock to the system. For decades, Western nations have measured Africa's progress through aid packages, debt relief, and development targets. Burkina Faso's $18 billion gold success rewrote that formula overnight. Here was a country that had built infrastructure, energy grids, and industries not through loans but through ownership. In policy circles, it became an uncomfortable example. If one African nation could grow without debt, what stopped the rest? In the United States, discussions about the Sahel rarely make front-page news. Yet, within think tanks and academic forums, Traoré's model has started to appear in quiet debates about economic sovereignty. Some call him a populist, others a pragmatist in uniform. But for older Americans, those who remember the Marshall Plan, the Cold War, and the rise of global capitalism, the question feels hauntingly familiar. What happens when the periphery decides it no longer needs the center? Meanwhile, across the Sahel, a subtle revolution continues. Mali and Niger have joined Burkina Faso under the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a coalition not born of ideology but of exhaustion. Exhaustion from being managed, indebted, and dictated to. Together, they are discussing joint energy corridors, regional trade routes, and even the creation of a Sahelian currency backed by gold and uranium. It's a radical idea, one that could free millions from the grip of the CFA franc, a colonial relic still tied to European banks. For Western powers, this shift is unsettling, not because it's anti-Western, but because it's self-sufficient. The fear is not rebellion, but replacement, a future where Africa no longer asks for permission to prosper. And as Burkina Faso's experiment unfolds, one truth becomes clear: the age of dependence is fading, and the age of ownership has begun. If our independence isolates us, Captain Ibrahim Traoré once asked, what exactly were we connected to before? It was more than a question. It was a mirror held up to the world. Because for generations, Africa's connections to aid, to debt, to foreign investors were built not on equality, but on dependency. Burkina Faso's gold revolution shattered that illusion. It proved that ownership is not arrogance, and sovereignty is not isolation. It is simply the act of keeping what is already yours. Today, the mines still operate, the refinery still hums, and the numbers still rise. But beyond the statistics lies something that cannot be measured in GDP dignity. For the first time in decades, a nation that once exported raw materials is exporting confidence. And that confidence, quietly spreading across the Sahel, may one day redefine Africa's place in the world. Yet, the challenge remains. Can Burkina Faso protect this model from the same global forces that once buried it? Can President Ibrahim Traoré's disciplined vision survive the weight of international pressure, sanctions, speculation, and skepticism? Or will the world once again find a way to punish those who choose independence over obedience? Maybe that's the question we should all be asking, not just Africans, but Americans too. Because history reminds us that power doesn't only belong to those who own weapons or armies. It belongs to those who own their wealth, their choices, and their future. And right now, in the heart of Africa, that truth is being written in gold. Please share if you feel you are among the first to understand and support what President Ibrahim Traoré is building for Africa. Subscribe if you believe that truth should matter more than headlines. Because the real treasure Burkina Faso discovered wasn't under the ground. It was in the realization that true wealth begins when a nation stops asking for permission to exist.